So I'm very, very pleased to be able to have Will Thompson join us to talk about artificial intelligence today. Will is the Chief Strategy Officer for Forbes Ignite. He was formerly the Senior Vice President of Insights and Strategy at Forbes. He's done thought leadership for The Economist. He was the CEO of Hedge.com, and he was the publisher and CEO of Ivy Magazine. He's got a Master's in Business Administration from the Herbert Business School at the University of Miami. And, I think Will's kind of humble about it, but I would say he's very much an expert on artificial intelligence as it's applied to marketing. We've had the good fortune at MASB of working with Will since 2017. And it perhaps is unbeknownst to you, but in the context of the Forbes Marketing Accountability Initiative powered by MASB, Will played a critical role in helping us host the ISO Technical Committee 289 plenary here in New York in June of 2019. And I think that event, you may think you're just hosting an event, you got to do all the rigor around the event, but it was very, very important on many, many levels that we hosted that event. It was important to show that there was commitment in the U.S. On the whole topic of brand valuation and evaluation standards. It was also very, very important because you could see Sarah DeSoz there from ANSI. It really, I would say, cemented their perspective that that we were their representative, and essentially we were deputized on all brand issues in the United States. And in addition to that piece, I think the Chinese had some skepticism and about the U.S. and our commitment, and the fact that we were willing to host that meeting and it came off so well, really kind of changed their perspective on us. And I think we're much more collaborative than with the Chinese than we might have been previously. And all of that is because Will and Forbes did a lot of things to make sure that we had a fabulous meeting at Forbes on 5th. So I know I've done it personally with you before, Will, but I really want to say thank you for doing that, because its impact, I think, continues to kind of reverberate in a very positive way for MASB today. So thank you very much for doing that.
Well, no, thank you. And thank you for having me here today. And truth be told, 99.9% of the credit goes to Bruce Rogers and Steve DiOrio. Bruce for starting this initiative. I just grabbed the torch where he left off, and Steve is a brilliant mind and an amazing worker who basically did everything. So I in turn thank them.
Well, they did do tremendous work, but I think you're very politely deflecting credit, which occurs to you as well. So.
Yeah. But hey, can I go off script very first thing?
Sure.
So I just want to comment on the brand valuation piece, and then we'll get into the artificial intelligence thing. So I think all of us have had this experience of sort of sitting down in a smoke or vape filled room with senior executives of various organizations, and everybody, when you get a drink into them, says, I wish we weren't so short term. I wish we weren't so focused on the quarter. Are there other measures, or maybe we look at well-being? Maybe what are some ways that we can find longer term measurements? Well, I've got a couple for you right here, because if you use brand valuation, and especially, and I was introduced by Dave Reepstein to the concept of valuing your customer portfolio as a financial asset, because after all, what is the value of the stock price other than the net present value of all current and future customer relationships? Well, there you have a long-term measure. And so I would contend that this isn't a technical issue. This is an issue that the entire business community needs to be paying attention to if they want to find the most effective way to shift from short-term management to long-term success.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you have that conversation. The whole notion of what happens in a reporting space these days seems to overwhelm the conversation about, well, what's the right thing to build the business over the long term, right? And that's really it's a conversation that needs to happen more broadly, but unfortunately has not been getting its due to this point. So before the thunderstorms intervened, Will was going to come speak with us at the Blackwell in Chicago in August of 2019. And we originally were calling this AI, the magic money-making machine. And then in this past February, or a year ago February, our last in-person meeting, we kind of changed that a little bit to AI and the magic customer getting machine. So we moved it from just making money to building customer franchise. And Will, I must say again, we do all sorts of post-meeting assessment and evaluation, and your presentation there was exceptionally well received. So I thought we'd start with, here we are, something like 62 weeks later than that presentation, but we've been through this ridiculous thing called the pandemic. What has accelerated, what has decelerated, and what has stayed the same about the trends that you were talking about when we got together in February of 2020?
I'd say that what has happened is that the race to table stakes has become one that is red in tooth and claw. And so you're seeing, yes, a lot of innovation and a lot of business model transformation at the edges. But really what's happening is so many organizations that realized that they were being outplayed and they thought they had a few years to make these investments and catch up, have realized they had a few weeks. And so we're seeing sort of a dramatic seismic shift in terms of technological and data capabilities. And I want to stress that in a box, right? That has really sort of evened out across a lot of the bigger players in the world. But I think what's really interesting is not the innovation that has taken place, although you can point to discrete examples, but the innovation that could take place. Because I was rather sanguine, despite the text of or the title of the presentation, about like what AI could do for marketing. And so if you think about it on the way that we think about self-driving vehicles, they have 6 stages of autonomous driving, going from zero, your standard 1956 Cadillac, all the way up to full self-driving. And I said that we were somewhere last year in between sort of the Lexus that allows you to parallel park that parallel parks itself, and sort of the Mercedes that can drive on highways under limited condition. In a year, the capacity of what we're able to make self-driving within our marketing machine, so to speak, has shifted a whole stage. We're basically at the Tesla autopilot stage, where in most circumstances the car can handle itself, but it still requires human intervention. But here's the important thing: a Tesla can't tell you where to go. It can't tell you what to prioritize on your calendar to figure out, well, what should I make this trip over that trip? And in the same way, nothing has, nor do I believe ever will, automate away the necessity for human creativity, for strategy, for understanding where the pieces on the board need to be deployed, not just how to make the next move. And so I'd say that's really the evolution that's taken place. And I'll just say one more thing before I shut up, is that you can sort of broadly see business separating into 2 camps. The camp that believes in the Rube Goldberg theory of marketing and business, and the camp that believes in the human theory of marketing and business. The Rube Goldberg folks think that, we have the most magnificent set of pipes and we just shove some undifferentiated ball through it and it's going to smack somebody in the head. And like, I ought to buy a Coke. And so all they do is they focus on those pipes, getting them ever more efficient while not giving a damn about what message is actually going through and to who. The human theory of marketing has great pipes, but they use them to think about who are the human beings that I am serving in all their complexity and glory and chaos, and how can I actually serve them better to make more money. Sounds obtuse, but that latter group of people, those are going to be the aircraft carriers in this stage of business warfare. And the battleships, the old Rube Goldbergs of the day, they're going to go by the wayside.
So it's a very interesting distinction about Rube Goldberg versus more human focused piece. It seems to me that the scale of messaging is actually more weighted toward the Rube Goldberg thing right now, right? Because everybody's focusing on the shiny new technology or the shiny new application of technology. Why do I don't want to bore everybody with the Gladwell phrase, the tipping point, but why do you think that the human approach is going to ultimately succeed? And what evidence do you have that is starting to happen if it has indeed?
I think there's two great stories, but I'll start with one because I think we might get to another later. I'll start off with Wayfair versus Amazon. So Amazon is the classic Rube Goldberg company. They talk about customer centricity, and with great respect, I'm sure many of the people within that organization are. But I've been in a unique position over the past several years to sort of have FaceTime with human beings of all sorts of folks within this ecosystem. And I've got to tell you, that's
FaceTime with a small F and T, not
yes, that's FaceTime with a small F.
Right?
Yeah, no, thank God I haven't had capital F FaceTime with them. But anyway, what ends up happening is the gap between theory and practice is quite high. And most of the folks there really view a company as a machine and customers as pieces to be moved around a chessboard when you get right down to it. Wayfair, on the other hand, is trying to go head on against Amazon in one of the most lucrative markets within commerce, furniture, home decorations, and things like that. So, example, when I was building a house, a year or so ago, I called Amazon. I needed to return something. Good luck getting through to anybody. Good luck managing anything that you wanted to. Call Wayfair. Wayfair basically called the manufacturer, called their legal department to make sure everything was up to code in the place where I was in. They treated me like a human being. And guess what? And by the way, I ended up returning the thing that we bought in question in the first place. But I spent so much more money through Wayfair versus Amazon. And yes, they use data to enable that interaction, but they use data to enable the people who interfaced with me because I'm not a computer. So that's the difference. And you can see that they've been really succeeding in that area.
So if you talk to people that are probably more on the Rube Goldberg side of the divide, I would say for the better part of 15 years, they've been touting one-to-one marketing. Whereas the folks on the human side, they talk personalization, but not necessarily down to the individual level. Is that consistent with what you're seeing, or how do you look at that particular instance?
It's consistent with the state of play, but I don't think it's necessarily consistent with what the future of the state of play could be. It all depends on how we use the tools at our disposal, because in the intervening time between last year's presentation and now, there have been massive advances in what they call low code or no code machine learning, or auto ML, automated machine learning, which basically allows any Rube like me to actually program or train a model for pretty complex tasks. It puts a lot of capability in the hands of subject matter experts, not just technicians. Not only that, but you've seen GPT-3, which is one of the foremost natural language processing and natural language generation algorithms come out of OpenAI. You'd be convinced, if you use it correctly, that a human had written it. And there have been a huge number of advances in GANs, generative adversarial networks, which create images, audio, video out of completely whole cloth, so that in theory, if you went to the trouble of understanding psychographically your customers, understanding them as human beings, and you were able to compile a sufficient data set on that, it would be possible to have truly effective auto-generated one-to-one messaging, but I think it's not that the tech isn't available there to do it more or less. It's the mindset isn't there yet. And it's going to be a few years off before we see somebody brave enough to try it and brave enough to fail for the first few times they try.
So one of the comments that I've heard with some frequency about one-to-one marketing, especially in a as we head toward a post-cookie world, is that one-to-one marketing is kind of spooky because you think that they know too much about you. Is that just because I tend to be with more poetic type people, or is that something you're seeing some prevalence in?
It's both spooky and dumb. So I'll tell you why. So there were, I don't know if it was the last presentation that I gave, but there's a slide somewhere in one of my talk decks where there's a Twitter post from this lady saying, you know, I just bought a vacuum cleaner off of Amazon, and they continue to follow me around with vacuum cleaner posts, like I need another one after I already bought one.
Right.
So most of the one-to-one marketing tools are pretty simplistic when you dig underneath the technical babble. You say, oh, he bought this, let me follow him around. You know, not that complex. Not only that, but it is pretty spooky. And so it's far better if you're able to have a sophisticated understanding of the people you serve to be able to reach out to them with something that is more contextually aware, but we'll see how that evolves.
So let's dig on that a little bit for a second. So one of the surprising things to me, when I was at McCann Erickson and Coke was one of my major clients, you know, McCann had a relationship with MIT Media Lab. Mm-hmm. So this is early 90s, right? And you know, the whole notion that I could make a recommendation to you about an upcoming musician that you might like, mm-hmm. based on knowing your musical tastes, you know, they were able to demonstrate that at MIT Media Lab in like 1993, right? Mm-hmm. So why is it, to use the example you just used with that woman, why are we still dealing with people being ghosted by whatever their last purchase was, even if it's something that should have a useful life of several years, you know, in this day and age? What hasn't happened to make that more beneficial to both the company and the consumer?
I think it's two things. One is if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality, which ignores all the ways in which it indeed is broken. Right. Because if these things didn't work, if they didn't generate significant revenue, they wouldn't be done. But at the same time, there's a phenomenon in artificial intelligence that very often the most simplistic solutions tend to be the most effective, not always by any stretch of the imagination. And so if you can look at only a couple of variables and predict X with 80% accuracy, well, then why would you drag in 1,000 more? It seems like a lot of work for nothing. And given that X is the measurement of revenue coming in, they're not looking at long-term, you know, customer value. They're not looking at brand health. They're not looking at any of these longer-term measures. The algorithm, which basically the way that most of these things work is they're relentless optimizers, or better yet, like a millennial office worker. You give it you say, go and do X, and it'll do exactly that, regardless of what kind of stupid things it has to do in the process to get there. It will do exactly what you tell it. And so if you're telling it, just give me more sales, well, that's what it'll do to the exclusion of all the other harm that it could be doing.
So there's obviously been more rapid adoption of all sorts of technology-enabled behavior because of the pandemic. When you see what has gone on, there's the great debate about what behaviors are going to sustain as we hopefully start opening up versus what will be referred to as, oh, that's what I used to do back in the pandemic days.
No. And the question is, what behaviors are going to sustain and what are going to remain?
Yep.
So
sustain or get thrown by the wayside.
You know, I wouldn't be able to answer the question, but I should be able to answer how companies should approach finding the answer for themselves. So ultimately, the thing that companies need to do is understand that like I can't predict any of those things with high enough accuracy to make financial investments on them. They probably can't either. And so the very most important thing that they need to do is to set up a listening post effectively, to listen to their customers, not just for when they think they're going to be ready to send them the next check, or how often they're clicking on ads or attending webinars or things like that, but really actually listening to them as human beings. And you can do that electronically. Certainly, there's plenty of data tools available to look at customers' behaviors across the web, the morality of which may be slightly suspect, but we'll leave that there. The other thing that you can do, which is a completely non-technical solution, is talk to your freaking customers. So Steve Blank, one of the great pioneers in sort of startup theory and things like that, said he spoke to about 1,000 customers in a year. And because he did that, he was able to detect weak signals. He was able to see things changing as they changed so that he could be nimble. Now, what we have today that Steve Blank didn't have is more sophisticated and automated mechanisms for sharing knowledge internally, so that the knowledge of what Steve Blank had in his head doesn't have to be confined to a Salesforce CRM call report, doesn't have to be stuck in his head. It can be something that is automatically provisioned to frontline workers, midline workers, and senior management in the formats that they need to make the decisions or tactical actions that they need. So it's about agility and being nimble, because we probably won't predict, what's going to last and what's not.
So we're in a situation where a lot of people think if they plug marketing into the machine's going to give them the answer. And when I have those conversations with folks, one thing comes to the fore, and that is the whole notion of creation of hypotheses in terms of what matters to the business. Everybody seems to be doing somebody else is doing that. Mm-hmm. Is that a problem that you have noticed, or is that kind of outside the realm of the conversation right now?
It's a problem that actually extends from the basic science of artificial intelligence all the way into application. From the basic science era, there's actually a legitimate debate. Some would say that the debate has been closed about whether we even need the scientific method or hypotheses anymore. There's a number of advocates who say, look, if we're just swimming through this, stack of needles, we can find the right stacks of needles, with this, or the right pattern in the stack of needles, using this software. We don't need to have a hypothesis. We can just discover it. And in some applications, drug discovery being one of them, you've actually seen, yeah, that can be possible on occasion. But then you have the other group that basically says the quality of the answers you get is all about the questions you ask. And so then let's bring this up to the practitioner level. So what are the kinds of questions that you can ask of artificial intelligence? You can ask it to rank things. You can ask it to detect anomalies. You can ask it to cluster things. You can, ask it to predict the next order of things in a series. These are all very mathematical things. And so it can basically give you the answers to small tactical questions at this point. It can even make inferences, about what action you might want to take, although that the application of that is few and far between. But what it cannot tell you how to do is to set strategy or how to ask the right question. And that's where the majority of AI strategies fall flat, is that the technical people know how to ask machine-oriented questions that the machine can actually give you back a usable answer on, but they lack the understanding of business context and strategic context to be able to translate the business question into a math question. And no one, as you said, is taking real responsibility over that fundamental translation function. How do I take this business or marketing strategy question and translate it into something that a machine can answer? And that's the role of hypotheses, in my view, of AI within business.
So if you were advising a company with a good consumer franchise, how to think about AI and their AI approach for the next several years, what kind of objectives would you put out there for them, or maybe even before objectives, what kind of strategic North Star, if you will, would you suggest that they look at?
Yeah, I remember we were talking before about this, and one of the things that you also mentioned is that many of the QSR places are having a hard time getting employees.
Right.
And I think one of the things that an organization like that needs to realize is that its employees are its most valuable assets, aside from its portfolio of customer relationships. And the companies that seek to accelerate and enable those human connections between employee and customer are going to prosper, while those who don't do not. And so let me tell you a story about Chick-fil-A and the Ritz-Carlton. So the Ritz-Carlton, when it got launched here in the U.S., it was basically a licensing deal. And the old Ritz Hotel in London, a couple of entrepreneurs got together and said, "Hey, why don't we start an international brand?" One of the gentlemen that was part of the duo was a gentleman whose first name I still forget, but his last name was Schultze. And he was the one who architected the Ritz-Carlton way of service. So the answer is yes. Now, what is your question? Ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen, as you had mentioned, Tony. Now, when Chick-fil-A a few years ago, obviously, Marriott bought the Ritz, and that's all history. But when Chick-fil-A a few years ago went through its customer service reinvention program, because I remember a time when the Chick-fil-A drive-thrus were about on par with McDonald's or Burger King or all the other places I shouldn't be eating. But they hired Schultze to come in and take the Ritz-Carlton paradigm of service and apply it in Chick-fil-A. And now Chick-fil-A has the highest, revenue per store and blowing away the competition. They pay their employees better. And yes, they use technology. They have the iPads that you can use to make your order quicker in the drive-through. They have sophisticated management systems so that you don't get wrong orders or things like that. They look at the people within that Rube Goldberg thing and say, what is their problem? This person's standing at the cashier's desk. How can I make their job easier? How can I make it possible for them to connect with customers? And even, you might think this is beyond the scope of the conversation, but Chick-fil-A limits who its franchise owners can be so that they can really only focus on one thing: human connections within their community. And so it's that combination of machine intelligence enabling human connections, if done in a scientific way, that will allow any of these to succeed. But those who continue to focus on operational and cost efficiency as the North Star, well, good luck to you.
I think it was Horst, but I'm not positive if that's.
It was Horst. Yes. Thank you.
I was one of the benefits of working on the Coca-Cola business when I was at McCann was we were able to stay at the Ritz, and I always preferred Buckhead because it was a much more interesting neighborhood than downtown. So
yeah.
So Frank, I think we have time for questions, if that makes sense.
Yes, indeed. So let's open it up for anyone who wants to raise their hand to speak or to type it into the Q&A. And while we're doing that, well, if I might take one of my privileges and ask you a direct question. So. Yeah. So there's an old saying in the data analytics side that models are generally right, but specifically wrong.
Yeah.
And so, that goes to your point on these machine learning and AI type systems tend to go and maybe oversimplified to an extent, and they get it wrong. So what should, you talk about the customer listing system, how should companies respond when they find that they've done something either spooky or something that was, negatively impacting an individual consumer? What should they do?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it's part like well, first of all, it depends on the severity of the screw up. If it is a highly publicized screw up, then, your natural crisis communications playbook kicks in. And I think that's more well-trod territory, but let's focus on maybe some of the smaller screw-ups. Somebody basically says, you've been spamming me about this thing that I really don't want. Well, first of all, from a communication standpoint, in general, I'm sure there's going to be exceptions to this rule. It's better to actually have a person reach out to that person and say, "Our bad. You know, we've heard you. We think we know what went wrong. We think we can fix it." Secondarily, you need to actually, and that's one of the reasons why explainability is important within the context of the algorithms that we use for marketing. Most folks think that, or not most folks, but it's been argued rather, that because the actual real world impact of misserving an ad or misserving a message is much lower than that of, you know, an autonomous vehicle perhaps killing somebody, that these algorithms need to be less explainable and therefore can be less costly to create and manage. But I would say, especially if you look at your customer portfolio as being sort of one of those key financial assets that you have, well, wouldn't enough of those misfired interactions over time have a meaningful effect on the value of that asset? So I think it's pretty critical. So you need to then think about, what kind of variables have I not been considering? How can I add an additional layer of sophistication, whether that is just in the variables, whether that is in, you know, new approaches for analyzing the data, whether that is in creating sort of multivariate models which combine multiple methods of machine learning and converge on a particular answer. But basically, you have to move up the sophistication stack when it starts to pinch and bite enough.
Thank you. Yes, I really do think that it comes down to the personal support system. If there is, it used to be this idea of decision support systems in making decisions, but now that the algorithms are oftentimes making the decisions, then maybe it needs to reverse around to you're forced to actually respond to these other parts outside of the algorithm.
No, absolutely. And a special invitation for the academics in the audience today would be, if you think I've said anything that's completely full of it, I'd love to hear about it. I never claim that to be the oracle of anything, and I'm here to learn from everybody here as much as maybe I have something to convey.
So, well, let me ask you another question. If there was a company or an approach that you've seen in terms of integrating artificial intelligence into its marketing, decision-making, and assessment, and actually go-to-market process, that might be a good example or have some good practices, who might that be?
That's a really good question, because I think there are excellent practitioners of the Rube Goldberg school, but there are not so many that I'm aware of. And if anyone else is aware of examples of sort of the people that are at that level of sophistication, but within sort of the human school, I'd love to know about it. But I'd say that probably your usual suspects are going to be the ones that have the greatest sophistication in AI and marketing. Those would be the Googles of the world. And I don't think that comes as any surprise. I think what is unique about them is that because they have focused on relentless automation and data sharing across all functions, you might find that their sales, marketing, operations, supply chain are better integrated rather than marketing sort of being in its own informational silo.
So I'll give you an example, and I'm doing the classic bad thing if it's a brand that I know and love and have used, and it's a relatively small one. So with the acknowledgement that my very first job as a kid in high school was working in a shoe store, I became fond of quality shoes, right? You're wearing them all the time, and if you're in a place like New York, you walk all the time. So I became a big fan of Allen Edmond shoes, because the guy who owned the shoe store, who had very good judgment, said that they were among the best out there, and they lasted a long time, and they had a great recrafting program. I've actually been really impressed with their ability to integrate online sales with me, with also focusing on getting me to very specific locations here in Manhattan, even during the pandemic, right? So, they've identified me obviously as a loyal customer, but they're like, it would be easier for you if you want to actually pick up your shoes at our store and it'd be quicker, and we could do more customization if you're into it, right? And and they're not doing what we were referring to earlier as the ghosting, where they're trying to sell me the same shoes that I bought 5 years ago, which frankly I can just recraft anyway. So they seem to be doing the human side of the equation because they have the technology and they have the prompts to follow up, but they're really trying to do it as a make the customer even more wedded and even happier with the overall delivery of the product. So
no, that's a great example, and I'll have to look into that. Well, since I don't think we have any questions, I have one more interesting thing I can add to the conversation, I guess, before we wrap it up.
Yep.
Which is, okay, so what's next? And if up till now we've seen a race to table stakes, what comes after table stakes? And it actually speaks to what Mr. Fort was referencing earlier, that key challenge of integrating online and offline. Now, what's ended up happening over the past, decade plus is we've built a very effective online surveillance state, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
We can really tell, what's going to happen within that specific online world with great accuracy. We can use that data to create seamless predictive experiences within the confines of our owned platforms, right? Now, what's happening out in the real world, the world of atoms, not bits and bytes, is that the price of sensors is falling dramatically along the curve that you might expect with Moore's law.
That's sensors with an S, not a C, right?
Yes, exactly. Different kind of sensors. And so the cheaper they get, the more they're being embedded in things. And there's even an amazing sensor mesh that was created that I think quintuples the number of sensors that you can put on a given thing very cheaply. And so we're also finding that is converging with the next level of global positioning system that will enable, like, within a meter accuracy of positioning real things out in the real world. All of those devices are now being connected with 5G, allowing you to send a huge deluge of data back and forth to actually manage actions in the real world. And obviously the computing power enabled by the cloud is continuing to improve, and that is really the storehouse of most AI these days. And so when you put all of these things together, you're entering into a world where it becomes technically possible to create the same kind of predictive and seamless experiences in the real world as we've become accustomed to online, and to connect those two things. The challenge in doing that is twofold. One is the surveillance issue. There are huge moral dilemmas as to whether or not we should even do this thing, or if there are ways to do it in a private and compliant way. And second of all is simply human interests. The nature of competition and the nature of people being siloed off into their own worlds means that somebody's ox is going to get gored in this transition, and those who feel they have the most to lose tend to also have the biggest stake in the current order of things and are dragging their feet. But it's going to happen. The question is, how does it happen?
So why don't we use the last couple minutes? We didn't really talk in great detail about Forbes Ignite, but give us a sense of what you're working on with Forbes Ignite.
No, absolutely. So Forbes Ignite is the social innovation coalition. And so what that means is we bring together diverse experts and change makers from around the world, whether they be big company CEOs, 14-year-old science prodigies, 5-star academics. It ranges in the spectrum. We put them together into small groups, work using design thinking to work on global challenges, specifically for large organizations, because the large organizations in the world are going to be the ones who decide the future that we enter into? Is it going to be one that is sustainable and equitable or not? And the difference between whether we get to a sustainable and equitable future using technology, using innovation, using these kinds of experts is going to be whether we continue to pursue an incremental approach of, oh, I made my packaging 20% more recyclable, or whether we pursue full business model reinventions that are not just more sustainable and equitable, but also more profitable or better meet customer needs than the competition. The same way that, and I call this sort of the impossible burger model, because the impossible burger, you know, I prefer that over a meat McDonald's hamburger any day of the week if it's made better and it's more consistent quality. It does less for the planet, but it's just better. It's just better. And so if we can pursue that just better model of sustainability and equity, then I think we're going to find ourselves moving more quickly to avoiding civilizational catastrophe.
Great. Well, again, we can't thank you enough for all that you've done for MASB over the years, and greatly appreciate your insights about artificial intelligence going forward. And we look forward to having you in person again at one of our events, hopefully on October 7th this fall. So Will, thanks very much. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I'll talk to you soon.
Absolutely.